Good morning, everyone. We are happy to have you here. I am Stacy McGill. I'm the Graduate Student Congress president this year, and we are excited to be able to have this opportunity for our guest speaker today. We will be using the Q&A, so if you have questions, please type them in there and we will get to them towards the end of the presentation. If you have anything else, please let us know. I will go ahead and turn it over to Sarah, who's going to be introducing our guest speaker today.
Thank you, Stacy. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you attending this guest speaker. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. James Hayton. James is a PhD coach who owns his own business, PhD Academy, where he privately coaches graduate students, gives courses on academic writing and time management, and gives presentations at universities on various challenges faced by graduate students. He has also authored the book PhD, An Uncommon Guide to Research Writing and PhD Life, and has a YouTube channel filled with very helpful videos on navigating graduate school. I myself have relied on a lot of those videos as I was preparing for my qualifying exams, so those certainly helped me get through those. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. James Hayton.
Okay, thank you so much. So first of all, I just want to say what an honor it is to be invited to speak. This is the first time that I've spoken for a university in the US. So thank you so much. It's a great pleasure. First of all, a little bit about myself. So my name's James Hayton. I'm a former physicist. And for the last 11 years, I've worked to help PhD students and sometimes master's students as well with academic writing, general project management, and the overall goal of helping them to reduce the stress that they're under. So why is this an important thing? Why is stress such an important thing that we need to address? Well, I think there's a problem in academia with the way stress is treated. There are so many students and professional academics, for that matter, who suffer from overwhelming stress that many people assume it's either an inevitable or necessary part of the process. So if you want to be an academic, this is just what you have to go through. And I remember when I was doing my own PhD and I hit a serious low point. When I spoke to people about the stress I was under, everybody told me, it's okay. Everyone goes through this. Just keep going and don't give up. Now, this advice was well-intentioned, but to me, it really wasn't helpful because my situation wasn't okay. I wasn't okay. And the stress was so bad that it was affecting other areas of my life. It was affecting my ability to do the work, which in turn made me more stressed. And I was pretty sure that if I carried on the way I was going, then I would fail. And it was only when I started to make significant changes to the way that I worked and the way that I thought about the work that things got better. And these changes took me from the verge of failure to getting the results I needed for a few publications, writing my entire thesis in just 3 months, passing my thesis defense with 0 corrections, and most importantly, actually enjoying the final months of my PhD when most people are at their most stressed. So I think, or rather I know, that a PhD or a master's degree can and really should be enjoyable. It shouldn't be something that you endure or suffer through. And overwhelming stress isn't something we should just accept, but it should be seen as a warning signal that something's going wrong and something needs to change. Now, we can never completely eliminate all stress, and actually we wouldn't want to. Some stress is inevitable, and some stress is actually useful. And part of the whole point of a postgraduate degree is that it's a challenge, but it's how we manage the challenge and how we manage the stress, which is really key. So what is it we're aiming for? Well, there's a few things. I think we want to avoid a situation where the stress constantly builds, where you get more and more and more overloaded over time. So kind of like you're in this positive feedback loop, and you just have this goal of surviving or getting through to the end. What we want to do is manage the stress. We want to regulate the stress, a bit like a thermostat. So we give ourselves a bit of a difficulty, a bit of challenge. But if the stress level gets too high, then we have ways to regulate it, to bring it back down again. More specifically, we want to be able to think creatively and solve problems as they arise. We want to be confident in taking risks and coping with setbacks, which are inevitable. We want to be focused and engaged with the work, but also not overly attached to it and able to let go at the end of the day. And we want to be able to basically enjoy the work and maintain a happy and healthy life at the same time. Now, this might all sound like a fantasy, but I'd like to ask, why isn't this the norm? Why shouldn't we be happy and confident in our work? Or why shouldn't we at least aim for this as kind of an ideal? So if we're going to aim for such a drastically different result to what most people experience, I think we need to look at some of the common mistakes that students and academics make and find ways to do it better. So what I'll do throughout this talk is I'll give you some general principles and approaches and a few examples. But some of what I say might be quite challenging in that it goes against your instincts or your kind of natural reaction to some situations. So as I'm talking, you might think, well, yeah, that all sounds good, but this won't work in my situation. And if that's the case, what I'd like you to do at the end when we get to the Q&A is challenge me. Give me counter arguments or situations where you think it won't work. And then I'll do my best to modify the principles for your situation when we get to the Q&A. So I'm going to speak for about another 35 minutes or so. And then that'll leave plenty of time to, kind of dive into whatever other issues. I'm not using slides today because of some technical difficulties. So you'll just have to pay attention to what I'm saying, make some notes, and then I can always send some extra notes, in the next couple of days. So common mistakes that students and academics make. I'm going to start with a big one that I made right at the start of my PhD, way back in 2003. So one of the first things my supervisor asked me to do after I started was to write a literature review. And being a new student, I wanted to impress my supervisor. So I decided I was going to write the best literature review that the world had ever seen. And I even thought that I might be able to get it published because that would be such an amazing, impressive start to my kind of academic career. But of course, I didn't write the best literature review the world had ever seen. And I quickly got overwhelmed by the sheer amount of literature. And there was an enormous mismatch between the immediate ambition that I'd set for myself and my level of skill. So by trying to read as much as I could and trying to produce the best, most comprehensive literature review in the world, I didn't give myself the time I needed just to understand the content. And I think the real problem was that I went into that literature review trying to show my supervisor how good I already was, instead of using it as an opportunity to learn. So this particular way of thinking, this is what Stanford psychologist Carol Dweck describes as the fixed mindset. So that is attaching your self-esteem to showing how good you inherently are, versus the growth mindset, where the focus is on effort in improvement. And this fixed mindset is, I think, one of the biggest causes of stress among postgraduate students. And it's what lies behind what people often refer to as imposter syndrome, which is essentially the fear of being found out as not good enough. So if you go in with the attitude that I have to show how good I am, but then all of the evidence shows you that you're not actually as good as you think you are, then what this creates is this constant fear. And this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because that fear leads people to hide themselves, to not ask questions for fear of looking stupid, or to not submit work for fear of negative feedback. And in some extreme cases, I've seen people spend 5 years, 6 years, 7 years on a proposal because they're so afraid of not having something perfect or receiving any kind of negative feedback that it just stops them from really doing anything, which ultimately is just another kind of failure, even if it's not official failure. So what should we do differently? How should we approach it differently? Well, I think one of the first things is to see yourself as a beginner. So a lot of people think of a postgraduate degree as being kind of the pinnacle of the education system, right? So you go through school, you go through your undergraduate degree, and it's the very best people who end up doing master's degrees and PhDs. But instead of seeing yourself as like the very, very best student, I think it's much healthier to see yourself as a beginner. So even after you finish your master's degree or your PhD, you're still not going to be as experienced as someone who's been working in the field for 20, 25, 30 years. So your job is not to show how good you are, but to learn and develop your skills. And what this means is being open and honest about what you don't know. It means seeing other people who maybe know more than you as people you can learn from. And it means asking the potentially stupid questions early while you have time to learn, instead of trying to hide those things away and being afraid of being found out, either by your supervisor or possibly in your thesis defense. So approaching the work with this mindset, what practical steps can you take to develop your knowledge and skills? And this is an important question because in postgraduate study, you may not have the same kind of structured learning that you had as an undergraduate. And you may have to design much of your own schedule and your own priorities. And this is where a lot of people, again, start to go wrong. So if you're trying to learn any new skill, there are two common assumptions that people make. Number one, that practice makes perfect, and if you just need to keep doing something and you'll get better. And number two, that you need to constantly push beyond your comfort zone. Now, both of these things have a grain of truth to them, but they can easily lead to burnout, because they make you keep working, because practice makes perfect, and then constantly pushing. So you're working as hard as you can, doing things that you don't really know how to do. And if it's going wrong, then, the assumption might be that you just need to do more of these things. So there are some nuances to this in terms of how we need to approach it. The first nuance is that you need to vary the difficulty, adjust the level of the difficulty of the goals or the tasks that you set yourself. So sometimes, yes, you do really need to challenge yourself and work at the limits of what you can do. But more often, you should be doing easier things, but trying to do them to the best of your ability. So a good analogy for this is weightlifting. So a lot of people assume that in order to get stronger, they need to lift heavier and heavier weights each time they go to the gym. This will work up to a point, right? If you do this every week, you lift a heavier weight, you will get stronger. But you will then hit a plateau where you don't get any stronger and you're likely to get injured. And in fact, the most effective way, and this applies to kind of any sport or any skill that you're trying to learn, is to vary the difficulty or vary the intensity. Sometimes lifting much lighter weights, but maybe focusing on the basic technique, because that's what gives you the foundation for doing the more difficult stuff. So in academia, what this might mean is going back over some of the basics of your subject instead of reading that big stack of new cutting edge papers. Or maybe in terms of the experiments or whatever kind of research techniques you do, doing something simple and slowing down to try to do it well instead of focusing on the biggest, most impressive version of that particular thing that you can think of. And in the case of my literature review, what I should have done is focused on trying to understand the fundamentals of the techniques that I was going to use, maybe talking to people who had more experience instead of trying to write the best literature review the world had ever seen. The second thing you need to take into account is that you need to take risks and make mistakes. Now, a lot of students are really scared of making mistakes, possibly because they tend to be penalized throughout most of the education system. But mistakes are both essential and completely unavoidable. And if you excuse me, 1 second. If you make mistakes early, it's kind of ironic. As I'm talking about making mistakes, I kind of stumble over my words. If you make mistakes early, you can correct course. But if you avoid them, perhaps by over planning or constantly going back to read more, then you miss out on a lot of opportunities to learn. Now, I'll come back to what to do in response to mistakes or setbacks in a moment. But I just want to quickly mention a third element that's also often overlooked. And that is to build your network. So a lot of people think that the goal is to learn how to do everything independently. But actually, I think networking is one of the most important skills that you can learn. And one of the reasons why universities exist is to bring together people with different expertise and encourage collaboration and the exchange of ideas. Now, a lot of people get stuck in that fixed mindset, thinking, well, I'm not good enough, so why would they be interested in talking to me? Or I'm not good enough, and if I talk to that person, then they'll find out that, I don't know all of these things, right? It'll shine the spotlight on what I don't know. But if you go in with humility, and instead of thinking, well, what are they going to think about me? And just be interested in other people's work, that is the way to get them interested in you and your work. So find out what other people do, read their papers, even if it doesn't directly relate to your work, you never know how it could be useful later, and ask the stupid questions. Be curious, be interested in what other people are doing. And by building connections in this way, you effectively multiply your own ability. You will hear about things that you wouldn't have heard about if you were just using search engines. And you'll be able to access other people's expertise. So later on, when perhaps your work touches upon one of those research areas that someone else is a specialist in, you know who to reach out to, and they already know who you are. And of course, the whole postgraduate experience will be more enjoyable if you have some connections to the people around you. Okay, so let's go back to this idea of taking risks and making mistakes, because I think it's really important to have a strategy for how you react when things don't go to plan. So again, there are two common responses to mistakes or things not going to plan. And both of these common responses, well, they're wrong. They're not going to help you. So first common response is to just keep moving. So something goes wrong in your work and you just keep going. So to stay busy, you rush into it again, or you switch to working on something else. And this is especially common either once your research has become a bit more complex, so you've got multiple things to work on, or I will see it all the time in academic writing, where people hit a little bit of a block in the writing, and then they just switch to writing about something else because it's like, I must stay productive. I've got to keep putting words down on the page. And what happens is you then lose the opportunity to fix the problem that arose. So all you're doing is staying busy, but you're not actually resolving any of those issues. And the other common response is to disengage from the problem by checking email, which is easily justifiable because, maybe you've got an email from your supervisor, or you're waiting for a response about something. But it can easily lead to other online procrastination. So this is what I always used to do. And I would tell myself when something went wrong in the lab, I would tell myself, I'll just check email for 5 minutes or so. But then while email was loading, I would load another browser tab to check news headlines. And then I'd get caught in an online chat. And before I knew it, I'd lost 40 minutes, by which time it was nearly lunch. So there's no point starting work again. In both of these cases, they're both ways of avoiding the problem that has come up. And these responses, they deny you the opportunity to get feedback that the work is giving us. Right? So we stay busy, we stay overloaded, but nothing really gets done and no progress can actually get made. So what I'm going to give you is 5 steps to follow. So if you've been checking email or Instagram or watching cat videos while I've been speaking, now is the time to focus and write these steps down. Okay, so when something has gone wrong, step number 1 is to just stop, to resist the temptation to check email or to do something else. So when we're under any kind of stress or discomfort, we tend to take the first option that comes to mind. We tend to follow habit or instinct. But if we want to make a conscious reaction, then we first need to give ourselves a little bit of time and space to process and to think. Now, the most important thing here is to not go online. So do not check email. Do not pull out your phone. And this is much easier if you use internet blocking software, which I'll come back to later. But what you might need to do is turn your phone off and just step away from the computer. Now, you might feel some discomfort when you do this, and you might also be tempted to engage in other habits to bring that discomfort down or to distract yourself. But I think it's important to stay with the discomfort a while and get used to it and be okay with it. And if you forget everything else that I say in this presentation, this is probably the most important thing. So if you want to be able to manage your stress, you need to be able to sit with a little bit of discomfort on a regular basis and think your way through and process it and make a conscious decision on a small scale. Otherwise, what happens is that stress will build up and build up and build up and build up, and you never actually get a chance to process it. So just having that empty space I think, is probably the most important thing, so that you can feel the discomfort that you feel and then figure out a conscious, deliberate response to whatever the problem is. Okay, so step 2, having given yourself some space and some time, is to just process and to think. And there might be some obvious things you can do to solve the problem, but it's also useful to try to see some alternatives. So sometimes we can get stuck on a particular way of doing things. So it's good to think through, well, okay, I've got this one option, but what else could I try? And often the answer is to simplify what you're trying to do right now, reduce the scale of it, break it down possibly into smaller steps, and just focus on one of those at a time. And that's very often the most effective solution. But also you may need to approach it in a completely different way. Step 3 is to make a decision. So you could choose the obvious decision, the first, or the obvious solution, whichever was the first to come to mind. Or you could choose one of the alternatives, but you have to decide. So going back to the idea of taking risks, there's always the risk that the decision you make is the wrong one, that it doesn't work out. But if that happens, you already have, if you've taken some time to think things through, you already have some alternative approaches you can try. You've got your plan B or your plan C, right? So if something goes wrong, you just try one of those. But I think it's only possible to see those alternatives if you've given yourself some time and some space to think. Okay, step 4, having made a decision, is to take action. But the way that you take action really matters. So whatever you decide to do, the goal should be to do it with the utmost care and attention. So a lot of people focus on getting things done really quickly, or they worry about the end result. But we can't always control the end result. You know, if you're doing any kind of experimental work, you know, we don't necessarily know how that's going to turn out. But the most important thing is the care and the attention that you put into the small details. And that way, if you make a mistake, then it's much more obvious where it's gone wrong, and it's much easier to fix. Or if the experiment or whatever else you're doing doesn't work, you know that it isn't just from being sloppy in your approach or from rushing. And I think approaching the work in this way also instills a certain kind of pride in the effort, regardless of the end result. So our focus is on the process and much less on the outcome. And step 5, the final step, is wherever possible to try to see the work through to completion. So you might find a feeling of resistance to finishing a particular task, or a really strong temptation to do something else. But leaving things unfinished, I think, is a bad habit that we want to avoid getting into. So there's no way that you can finish a thesis if you can't finish the component parts. And you also can't make informed decisions about what to do next if you don't finish prior work. So if you go through these 5 steps on a regular basis, this gives you a way of responding to the minor discomfort of setbacks before it becomes completely overwhelming. So I mentioned at the beginning that there was a point in my PhD where I hit a serious low point, and I was pretty sure that I was going to fail. And basically, I had a really difficult project where the experiments that I was doing, most of the time, they just didn't work. So I had this equipment that I was helping to build and was supposed to be testing. And sometimes it seemed like for every step I took forward, I would take 2 steps back. So there would be times when it would take me 2 or 3 days to prepare an experiment, and then something would go wrong that would set me back more than those 2 days, and I'd have to start the whole thing again. And there were times when it felt like I'd be further ahead if I hadn't gone into work that day, just because it was so so unpredictable, so stressful, and so difficult. And some point in my 3rd year, I was working on these, making these little probes. They were basically optical fiber probes, where you have a single optical fiber. Now, the thing about optical fibers is because they're coated in plastic, they're flexible, so you can bend light around corners. But for various reasons that I don't need to get into, I had to remove that plastic coating, which just left this strand of glass about the thickness of a single hair. So obviously these things were incredibly fragile. They took a few days to prepare. So I'd make them in batches in case, some of them would always break, but hopefully enough would survive. So I was at the final stage of preparation of this particular set of probes, and I dropped them. Ruined 2 or 3 days work, and was basically kind of back to where I'd been a few days before. It wasn't the first time that this kind of thing had happened, but something inside me snapped. Right, there'd been so much frustration. I was so stressed out. I was so sick of not getting results. And instead of following my usual habit of just checking emails, what I did was basically swore loudly and stormed out of the lab. And I didn't know where I was going. I had no particular plan, but I started thinking, I can't take this anymore. I just can't do this. It's I'm working and working and working, and I'm just not getting anywhere. Other people have published all these papers. I still don't have a single publication. I've got a few months left to get the results. What is the point? So I walked across campus, found a bench, and sat down just to give myself some time to think. And I was thinking through about, do I actually want to continue doing this or not? And I thought, well, okay, if I quit, then I would have to find a job. But whatever I find, I don't know what I want to do, but it can't be as bad as this. I'll find something. I'd need to explain to my family, my friends, my supervisor. But, I think they would understand. So I thought, well, okay, maybe, quitting isn't such a bad thing. But then I thought, well, okay, there's still a few things I could try for these experiments. So I could try this thing and this thing, and then if they don't work, I can quit, right? But if I'm going to determine whether or not I stay based on these 2 things that I'm going to try, I want to make sure that I give it my best shot, right? So one final really good effort to try and make this work. And so I kind of composed myself. It took a little bit longer. Went back to the lab, slowed right down, and just thought, you know what? I'm going to do this as carefully as I possibly can, and I don't really care whether it works or not, because I can always quit anyway. So I started working really, really carefully, and the experiment started working. So then I was like, damn it, now I can't quit. So what it taught me was that all I really needed to do was slow down and take more care and let myself think through problems. And I've been under so much pressure that it's just like, I've either got to rush into the next thing and keep pushing, or I was distracting myself with email. But just by slowing down and giving myself time to think and putting care into what I did and not worrying so much about the end result and what it meant, actually things started to go well. And then I got the data for a couple of publications. I wrote my thesis with the same kind of attitude that, I don't really care what anyone thinks, but I'm just going to do this to the best of my ability. So that massively took the pressure off, and I could just focus on doing the work. I wrote my whole thesis in just 3 months. The examiners loved my thesis. I went on to do a couple of postdoc contracts, and this ultimately has led to where I am today. So it took me basically a breakdown and quite an unpleasant several months before getting to that point of realizing what I needed to change. But the difference was basically the difference between failure and pretty good success. And so these principles, these ideas, they don't necessarily require a breakdown. You can start to apply them much earlier, and then hopefully you won't have to go through the same kind of experience. So before we get into the Q&A, I'd just like to give a couple of extra quick tips, which I hope you'll find helpful. So one of the things I mentioned at the start was that one of the habits that we're aiming for is to be able to let go of your work at the end of the day. Okay, so you've got some kind of work-life balance. And so I think it's useful to have a bit of a routine to go through. So number one, I think it's good to stop while you still have something in reserve. Okay, so we want it to be sustainable from one day to the next. I think again this is especially true when writing. A lot of people think when they've got a bit of a flow, I need to keep going because what if I can't write tomorrow? But I think it's good to stop with a little bit of energy in reserve. Then it's much more likely that you will actually be able to keep that momentum going. And then take 15 minutes at the end of the day and write down what's on your mind and write down things that you have to do tomorrow, including any specific times of places you need to be, things that you need to do. I think this takes a lot of stress off because it means you're not suddenly realizing, oh, I've got to give this talk tomorrow or whatever it is, and you can be a little bit prepared. So having taken that time, you can think, what do I need to prepare now or tonight so I'm ready for those things I have to do tomorrow? And then decide what your priority is and define specific tasks to work on. And what this means is that you never start the day not knowing what you're going to do, which is very often how people end up drifting and just following kind of bad habits. So a lot of people focus on planning for the long term, so making a 3-month plan, 6-month plan, 1-year plan, but then fail to follow through. But I think that if you want to succeed in the long term, it's not about having that perfect Gantt chart for the next 6 months. What you need to do is follow through on what you intend to do in the short term. Because there's no way you can follow a long-term plan if you can't follow through on what you intend to do today. So when you set those goals for the next day, I think it's absolutely essential to follow through with your intentions. And again, you might feel some resistance or discomfort to doing this, even if they're kind of little easy things. And you might tell yourself, it's okay, I can do that tomorrow. But as soon as you start putting things off, as soon as you start not following through with what you intend to do, you train that as a response to any kind of resistance. So that becomes the habit that you develop. You also kind of let yourself down, not following through on your promises to yourself, and that can kind of eat away at your confidence and add to the stress over time. So I think it's really important that you recognize moments of resistance, recognize that kind of minor discomfort, and engage in those battles to overcome the resistance. And if you do that for the easy things on a daily basis, the bigger things will be much, much easier. And the final thing I would suggest at the end of the day is to turn off your email until the next morning. So I think that, a lot of people kind of think that they've got to be on email all the time, but then you have no downtime. So you might get an email at like 10:30 at night, and then that's what you're thinking about, while you go to sleep. Email can wait till the morning. So what I do personally, I use an app called Freedom to block my email outside working hours, and it's massively reduced my stress because I'm no longer, for example, checking email when I'm in the queue at the supermarket. I also use another app called Cold Turkey during the working day to block distracting sites on my laptop during the workday. So it's not possible for me to check Facebook on my laptop right now, for example. So it kind of removes that temptation to distract yourself with those online things. And again, you might feel some discomfort to turning off email, but I guarantee that it's worth it if you stick with it for a few days. My final tip, which relates to the point I made about asking questions earlier, is if you find the level of stress is building up and is starting to affect other areas of your life, and it's eating away at confidence, and you're not able, you don't feel like you're able to kind of make any progress, is to make sure that you speak up if something's wrong or you're unhappy about something, and seek help, because everything is more difficult when you're on your own. And whatever you're going through, you're probably not the only one who's been through it. So all of these tips, they're things that are very easy for me to say, but if you're under a lot of stress, then they can be quite difficult to implement. And sometimes just finding someone to speak to, whether that's friends or family, or speaking to a professional. And professionals are often better because they won't just say, oh, it's fine, just keep going. They'll be able to, take the time to talk things through with you. It's something that I did towards the end of my PhD and also at various other stages of my life. So if you need to seek help, it's okay. Okay, on that note, we'll get into the Q&A. We're on about 43 minutes, not bad. I was aiming for 45, so not too bad. What I will do, I'm just going to turn my mic off and the camera off for about 60 seconds, just so I can have a mouthful of tea, rest my voice a little bit because it's starting to go, and then we'll get stuck into the Q&A.
Sounds great. So if anyone has questions, please go ahead and put those in the Q&A, and we will get started on that. See if I can.
Okay, so Stacey, I think you said you were going to read out the questions. So
Yes.
yeah, we're good to go. If I need another break, I'll take one.
Perfect. Just let us know if you need a break, and we will make that happen. Okay, so our first question is, I wonder if you might have any tips for people who identify as neurodivergent and maybe some advice cannot be applied the same to them.
Okay. Yeah, I think it depends on what the condition is, and probably first of all getting a proper diagnosis. So I know several people who quite recently have been diagnosed with ADHD. It started off as a maybe a suspicion from hearing more about it, because I think it's becoming more of there's more public discourse about it. People are more aware of it, more accepting of it. So speaking to a specialist, in some cases that might mean getting medication, or working on specific behaviors. So without knowing more or any specifics, that would be my kind of general advice. But thinking about, for example, ADHD, I would say a lot of the same advice applies, but perhaps more so. So things like blocking certain distracting websites, just removing that option. I think I would advise it to anybody, but I think I'm just sticking with the ADHD example because it's kind of fresh in my mind. I think that becomes even more important. Personally, I have it set on a schedule. So automatically between 9 and 5, certain websites are blocked, and I just cannot access them, and it makes my life infinitely easier. So that would be that would be my general advice. Speak to a specialist, and definitely out of the tips that I've given, try them out and find what works best for you.
Okay, that's great. Okay. Do you have any advice on how to deal with the culture of competing with other grad students, such as number of publications, grants, all of those things? How do you still maintain confidence within this culture?
Okay. I think a little bit of competition can be a good thing. It depends what effect it's having on you. If you start to get this kind of imposter syndrome, like, oh, everyone else has got publications, everyone else is getting these grants, I'm the only one who's not getting it, and it kind of makes you hide away, that's obviously not a good thing. If it kind of drives you to like focus even more on your research, it can be good. But one thing I think is important is to have kind of a sort of cooperative competition, right? So even though you might want to sort of slightly one up somebody else, right? Basically, if you're in the same research group, you should be on the same team, and you should be kind of willing to help each other out. If there's an atmosphere of people undermining each other, that's really unhealthy, and you just want to don't spend time around those people. So yeah, it kind of depends on the dynamics within the group. But I would always say the best thing is to be consistently curious, and trying to learn as much as you can. So if somebody's just got a grant, right, and they've had a successful application, it's like, first of all, be happy for them, right? Even if they're kind of a competitor and you think, damn it, be happy for them, express that, and ask them, when you're putting your can I see your grant application, like, and how you put it together, and try and learn from them. See it as an opportunity to learn, rather than, oh, I'm not good enough, and kind of shrinking away. That I think is so important.
Perfect. Okay. Do you think it's helpful to take brain breaks throughout the day? I know that some people may take breaks by checking their phone or going to socialize with a friend in their office. These may be considered ways to reward yourself for completing a certain amount of work. Would you advise against this, as it may become a source of distraction during the workday?
I think checking the phone I would not see as a reward personally. I think if that's what you reach for immediately, personally, I find that an incredibly destructive habit. And I'll often find myself doing that when I don't know what to do. When I've got a little bit of that tension, a little bit of that stress, I can reach for the phone because it's like full of infinite, infinite distraction. So a real break, I think, get away from the screen, and you should have some time where there's no input, where you can just process what's in your head. Yeah, obviously, I'm not saying never use your phone, right? They're very useful things. But if it's a way of distracting yourself from reality, I don't think that's very I don't think that's a very good thing to do. So I think having a real brain break where you get away from the computer screen, away from email, away from your phone, maybe just go sit outside and think through think through what you've done, think through whatever problems you're facing, or just sit and do nothing and let your mind wander. I think is a really good thing. Socializing with people, yeah, great. We need human contact, and often a lot of the people who come to me, it's because they've completely isolated themselves. So I think that social contact is certainly healthier than reaching for the phone all the time.
Perfect. I think in some ways, some of that social contact has been harder the last couple of years.
Of course. Yeah.
And I think we've all learned how important it is to be able to have that interaction with other people.
Yeah, totally. And of course during lockdowns and everything else, phones and Zoom, it's been, it's kept people in contact. It's just when we reach for the phone as a default habit, I think I personally find that really, really unhealthy, and it's the worst habit I have. So what I've started doing is, from about 8 or 9 in the evening, I just turn everything off. So I'm using that cold turkey software. I block all browsers on my laptop. On my phone, I block all websites. And then I'm left with this space. And it's really nice because I can read a book. I can, meditate, do yoga, do whatever else. And it opens up far more possibilities than just sitting and, I don't know, watching rubbish on YouTube, So yeah, it's the technology, it's a blessing and a curse. 1 second, I'm just going to plug my laptop in because it's getting low on battery. Bear with me 1 moment. Okay, sorry about that.
The blessing and curses of technology.
Indeed. Okay, yeah, so ready for the next one.
Question. How do you combat outside things like children, I would say pets, those types of things?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, if you, it's interesting the choice of the choice of wording, combating those things. I mean, if you've got kids, or even if you haven't, and you've got whatever relationships, those I think are the most important things in life, right? And so I think what you want is to ideally stop the postgraduate degree from affecting that too much, rather than the other way around. And probably the way to do it is to try and make sure that during your working day, that you're finishing the day kind of satisfied with what you've done and then being able to leave it behind. Whereas if you kind of start the day and it's just this kind of like, I don't know what to do. I've got this paper and this paper and this paper, and I've not made any impact. I think this goes back to what I was saying about slowing down a bit, identifying a particular priority, and just doing it as carefully as you can. And if you can do that, then I think it's less likely that you'll also trying to stick with that task and get it done instead of jumping around. I think it's less likely that you kind of have this situation where you come home and it's like, oh, I need to be working, I need to keep working, I need to keep working. Now, I know there may be some other things. For example, if somebody is working a part-time job, is a single parent looking after kids and trying to do a full-time PhD. I do come across these situations. Then I think sometimes something's got to give, right? So maybe switching to a part-time PhD, maybe finding a different job that gives you more predictable hours, maybe arranging childcare. You've got to somehow, make it all work. Yeah, and sometimes, if it's just not working at the moment, then you've got to change something, and just trying to endure and suffer your way through. Nobody benefits from that, especially if you've got a family. But it is a difficult one in that situation.
It definitely is. This is a really interesting question. How do these strategies apply for advisor relationships? What do you do if you don't think your advisor is giving you the space to take time to approach things in a healthy way?
Okay. What do you think if you don't think your advisor is... Generally, the first thing I would say is to speak to your advisor, right? Very often, I mean, this is always one of those difficult things because it depends on the relationship between two people who I don't know, right? So I don't know exactly what the dynamic is, but so I'll have to speak in general terms. What I've seen sometimes is that students will make an assumption about what the supervisor thinks or wants. And so then they go off and try and do that thing, but they don't say anything to the supervisor if they don't know what to do, or if they can't handle it, right? Because again, you don't want to show that you've got to show how good you are, right? In every situation, which stops you asking for help until it gets so bad that you have to take time off because of the stress. So the first thing I would say is always try and talk to the supervisor and say, hey, look, I'm a little bit overloaded at the moment. So this thing you've just asked me to do, can it wait for 2 weeks until I get this done? Or do you really need it done now? Because what happens most of the time that I see is people just say yes. It's like, oh, my supervisor's asked me for it, so I've got to do it now. In reality, often the supervisors, they're busy with other stuff. And so they've said this off the cuff kind of remark. Oh, maybe you could try this. And then the student goes like, oh, I've got to do that. That's another 6 months work, and the supervisor hasn't even given it that much thought. So you've got to talk to your supervisor. However, there are situations where supervisors, aren't very sympathetic and they don't respond very well to that sort of thing. In that case, so if they start, again, this is like less common, but I do hear about these things. If the supervisor says, well, if you can't handle this, then you shouldn't be doing such and such thing, or they start putting you down. In that case, personally, I would leave because I don't want to work with that person. But you've got to, that's kind of rare. It does happen, But I think if you're in that situation, you've got to speak up, try and change supervisor, because that's not cool. So yeah, first option, speak to your supervisor.
So do you have any tips for how to start those conversations, where to start with them, and how to broach those subjects with your supervisor?
Again, it kind of depends on what your relationship is like. But in most cases, if you just say, like, hey, if I could just have a quick word with you. To be honest, I'm feeling a little bit overloaded. I've got all these things piled up, and that thing you asked me to do. Is it okay if that could wait a little bit so I can just clear out some of my to-do list, and I don't think it should matter that much how you broach it, but if you broach it honestly, and two people with good intentions are not going to clash, right? And if somebody says, look, I'm struggling, in most cases people will react sympathetically, right? If they don't, that's not on you as a student, I don't think, right? And I think it's the only bad way to approach it is to not say anything and just take on more and more and more, and then it gets more and more difficult. And my point of view from a if I was a supervisor, would be like, why didn't you say anything? Because how could I know if you don't speak up? So yeah, I don't think it matters that much how you broach it. It shouldn't offend somebody. If you approach it honestly and openly.
Any tips on actually letting go at the end of the day, especially during stressful times? I go home and just dread the next day because I know all the complicated things awaiting me, and I don't get any meaningful rest because of that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I've already mentioned kind of switching off, not checking email, that kind of thing. But I think it's good to have some other things in your life that you invest in for your own well-being. So, and again, this has been more difficult in the last 2 years because of COVID, but things are starting to open up again. Having things like a sports group that you go to, yoga class, whatever it is, where when you leave for work, you've got something else to go to, where that's what occupies your mind. And I think doing things physically is great to sort of get yourself out of your head, especially difficult things. Whether that could be yoga, it could be martial arts, it could be rock climbing, running, whatever it is. I think doing things physically is one of the best ways to leave that behind. I also think that in terms of just a sort of good foundation for happiness in life is working on your relationships. How often are you speaking to friends and family, and sort of maintaining those and making sure that you're not just going home and sitting on your own and watching TV, because that it can be a route to just into depression, basically. So I think whatever it is, investing in those other things in life, so that the degree is not the only thing that your happiness depends on.
And to your last point, we have a question on managing. How do you, any tips on managing your relationships with people who are not in a PhD or doctorate program and are living a different lifestyle? So while those relationships are very important to foster, sometimes it becomes very difficult because the situation in the life that you're in a PhD program is very different than what you would be living if you weren't in the program.
Yeah. Well, I think there are two things. So maybe two things. I'm kind of thinking on the fly a little bit. One thing is clear communication. So, for example, if you need to spend extra hours at work, so if you have a conversation with your partner in advance, hey, I need to do this. Can you, pick up the kids? So like that communication, that negotiation. So it's all up front. Another thing would be, and sort of talking about whatever division of responsibilities. I think another thing is, sometimes having some time, again, where you leave the degree behind and you just say, hey, I know I've been really busy for the last couple of weeks. Let's go and do this, right? So, just a little thing like that can make a massive difference. And instead of it kind of letting it build up and build up and build up and, yeah, because it's not necessarily nice for the other person, right? If they never get to see you, right? And you're constantly in this really stressed out state. And I think yeah, also yeah, just trying to look after yourself. I think in any kind of relationship, it's not just about how you treat the other person, but how you treat yourself. So if you notice, I think if you notice your stress level building and building and building and building, right? You've got to, for your own benefit, have a bit of a pressure release valve, right? So taking some time. I think the thing of like taking some time where you're not doing anything, where you pause and process, is super, super important. So you can then realize, like I'm super stressed right now. I'm going to communicate that to my partner so it doesn't come out in an accidental way. And maybe then you also need to go and meditate or do something to kind of release some of that pressure. It's a difficult one, because relationships are complicated. But those are the kind of thoughts that immediately come to mind.
So how do you start to get out of the mindset that if you're not working, X amount of hours a day, that you're not being a good grad student, or if you do take those days off, that you're being unproductive and it's just going to set you behind further. So then those days of rest aren't actually days of rest.
Okay. I think the focus on the number of hours, or the productivity, obviously you need to put in a certain amount of time. What's more important to look at is what you do with that time. Because certainly speaking for myself, I know that a lot of the time that I spent on my PhD was wasted, because I wasn't in the right headspace. So I mentioned that I was kind of rushing experiments, not consciously, but it was like this sort of pressure would build up. And I kind of didn't quite expect the experiments to work. So I was sort of subconsciously undermining myself. So it's counterintuitive, but sometimes slowing down means that you get things done faster because you're doing things more carefully. You can then, because it's more likely to actually work out, you can leave work behind feeling like, oh, I've actually achieved something. Whereas the people who spend 16 hours a day, I've worked with people who are working that long and it takes them 2 years to write a thesis, because they're just in such a panic, and, I was working maybe 6 hours a day and I did it in 3 months, because I was more relaxed. There's other factors, but I I don't think stressing about the number of hours is in any way helpful. And you've got to look at what you're doing and how you're doing it more than how many hours you're spending doing it. Because there's only 24 hours in the day. If you spend 8 hours sleeping, which is super important, don't give up on your sleep. If you're giving up on sleep, it's not sustainable. You've got to invest time in your relationships, take time with your family, with your kids, whatever. And then you've got the work. So how are you going to get the best out of that time? And I think do less and do it better is the way forward.
Do you have any tips for working from home and how to separate work from home when they're effectively the same space?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, so take some time. It's that 15 minutes I was talking about before, and put everything away, tidy up, right? So you've got a bit of a ritual of kind of closure. Another thing that might be useful is when you finish work, get outside, right? Just get away. So you've got a physical separation, and then you can come back. So put everything away, get out the house, maybe go for a walk, go for a run, go to the supermarket, whatever you need to do. So you've got just a bit of a physical kind of separation. And I think try not to mix the use of your computer for work and for leisure, or at least not in the same spot. So if you want to make a Zoom call or something, take your laptop somewhere else, right? So you've got a workspace and you've got a leisure space. If you're watching a film, don't do it sat at your desk, right? So you've got that separation. But yeah, it can be difficult. And I think if you're working from home, try to at least try to make sure you're getting out and seeing people again, even if it's just 1 or 2 days a week, just to maintain that social contact. Because if you're just sitting inside working, you never see the sunlight. It's really stressful. It's not natural. It's not normal. So trying to maintain those things. I'm working from home right now, and I try and get out first thing in the morning, and I try and get out after work if I'm working from home, and it does make a big difference.
So do you have any advice for managing stress when the stress comes from working with disagreeable colleagues or some of those personal issues between, staff and students or other lab mates or whatnot?
It depends on this again, kind of depends on the situation, and in what way they're being disagreeable. If somebody, for example, says something that you don't like, or if they have a habit of saying things that you kind of like, that's not cool. Again, I think it's better to raise it. It's better to talk it through and say, hey, look, that comment you made, I didn't really, I don't know if you meant what you meant by it, but I really didn't like that. That's better than, saying nothing and letting that frustration build up. I think you've got to say something and give that person the opportunity to correct, because they might not even realize that they're being offensive. This is kind of topical with what happened at the Oscars. You don't want to let that frustration build up to the point where it comes out in unfortunate ways, shall we say. So yeah, I think always, if there's an issue, raise it early. Try and talk it out. It might be that maybe they haven't said anything, but they seem a little bit odd with you, and you think, oh, maybe I've done something to offend them. Don't second guess it, raise it. These difficult conversations, They make life much easier if you have them rather than having them in your head and the stress building up. Otherwise, if someone's really difficult to work with, if you have a choice, work with someone else. I think, if for example, the match between you and the supervisor, you're always clashing, or if their research interests are not what you want to do, I think often it's better to say, hey, look, I don't think this is really working out, and maybe changing supervisors, and doing that early, means it will have much less of an impact. But it all comes down to communication, and if you don't talk about it, then there's no way of resolving it, and it doesn't get better generally.
So how do you start dealing with some of this if it's starting to affect your ability to sleep, even as you're keeping up patterns and habits such as working out or going to therapy, and that inability to sleep is then causing you to be spent on weekends so that you don't want to do anything but rest and do nothing?
I think if it's getting to the point where you can't sleep because maybe you've just got the idea, thoughts running round your head. I mean, if it happens, every once in a while, it's maybe not that big a deal. If that's constant, then you need to look at making some changes. Whenever people talk about sleep, there's a couple of things I usually ask, and often I'll ask about your sort of evening habits. So are you kind of working until 10, 11 at night, then trying to sleep? Because if there's no gap between work and when you go to sleep, then the first time you get to process is when you go to bed. So then, of course, your brain starts going. Likewise, if you finish work and then you just start watching stuff on Netflix, again, even though it's kind of like you're sort of relaxing, it's not really, because it's just blocking out any of the thoughts. You're just distracting yourself. So again, when you stop, you might be really tired when you stop watching whatever you're watching, but then you go to bed, and then it's the first time you've got silence and space for the thoughts and everything else to be processed. So I think putting in some space where you don't have that much input is really important for at least an hour or so before you go to bed, preferably 2. That would be my first suggestion. Just create that space where you turn everything off. I would start with that. If you are really, really exhausted, taking a day or two off, I think is a good idea, because sometimes, of course, it can build up, without really noticing, and you just suddenly realize, like, I can't think, and taking a day or two off is a good idea. Maybe getting out of town for a couple of days or something just to recharge your batteries. But I would start with that evening ritual. Do you have a couple of hours where you don't have a screen in front of you, and you can just be in your own head for a little bit before you go to sleep? I think it's a good thing.
Perfect. It's never good when things start impacting your sleep, because
No.
as you said, it
affects everything else. Yeah.
Does. Speaking from an international student point of view, a lot of times other forms of stress issues, whether related to a distant relationship, immigration uncertainty, things other than research, actually tend to affect my academic research accomplishments and my drive to work stress-free on a daily basis. I find it difficult to discuss these things with my advisor, with a fear of being judged as my inability to do my academic work.
Okay. So those other things, I mean, if taking, for example, the immigration status, often these, there'll be things in the background that you need to take care of. And sometimes you just have to, kind of take some time, say, right, I need to deal with this particular visa application or whatever it is. I need to just get that done, right? If that's something that maybe you put off, then, you know, the stress builds up, and you want to make sure you've taken care of everything you can. There will be things outside of your control. But then if you've done everything you can and you're kind of waiting for an interview with immigration or something like that, then I think having a single point of focus for your work, right? So if you're already a little bit stressed and then you come to work and you've got 10 different things you could work on, then it's going to be really hard. So taking that time again at the end of the day to plan for the next day and what you're going to do. So you got the thought arises about the immigration status, and it's like, no, I've got this single thing, I'll bring my attention back to that. If you've got one thing, it's going to be much easier. If then your mind wanders off again. Okay, bring the attention back. Mind wanders off again. So it's kind of like if you've done meditation and you focus on the breath, it's the same idea. You have focus on the task and you bring your attention back each time it wanders, and eventually you find you sort of get into it. And you know, you start thinking about the other stuff less, but you've got to have that single point of focus, and you've got to avoid all those other distractions which are so easy, you know, email, Facebook, Instagram, whatever. You know, remove that as an option. In terms of long distance, you know, maintaining kind of long distance relationships, I think making time for that, you know, and trying to separate that from working time. With time differences, maybe like you want to schedule a call with family, you know, at 10 a.m. on a Wednesday. Okay, so you schedule that in, but you don't necessarily want to have like all of these chats coming up while you're working. You know, turn that stuff off, you know, and make it clear with people, okay, you know, I'll chat to you later. Right now, I've got to be focused on this. You know, there's no way necessarily to remove all of those outside stresses, but I think having that single point of focus to come back to is important.
Do you have any tips for planning out your research goals, both in the long term and in the short term, and really making a plan of action?
Yeah. So I think the long-term goals usually are not that difficult to set. Most people, I find, you know, they kind of know what they're trying to achieve. What's more difficult and more important, I think, is the short term. So of these things, so I've got my milestones for the next 6 months. What you need to know is, what am I going to focus on right now? What am I doing today? Right? What do I need to do today in order to move me one step closer to that kind of 6-month milestone? That's where it tends to fall down. And what people will often do is try and make a timetable for the week. And I say, right, I'm going to get up at 5 a.m. on Monday, and I'm going to get 3 hours work done. And then I've got this. And then by 10 a.m., I'm going to do this thing. And it's super ambitious and super detailed. But then, of course, you don't get up at 5 a.m. You already feel like you're behind. Whole plan goes out the window. So it's really just having a specific problem to work on, which is your main point of focus. And then letting go of the kind of timed schedule of when you will achieve that. Because very often you won't know how long it takes if you haven't done it before. And if it's a problem you need to figure out, it might be that it takes you 5 minutes. It might take an hour and a half. You just don't know until you do it. When you've done something 1,000 times, you can predict. You know, I know that just follow this process. You know, I know how long that takes. When you're doing something for the first time, or you're solving any kind of problem, what you need is the specific short-term objective. And just say, right, I'm going to work on this and I'm going to get it done. I'm going to find a solution, you know, and and that's really it. If you can do that on a daily basis, the rest will take care of itself, generally speaking.
Okay, we probably have time for one, maybe two more questions. We're coming up to the end. But this one actually is I think, a difficult thing for all of us.
Yeah.
What could be a way to really separate your self-worth from how good you are? I've been trying to
Yeah.
be graceful with myself, but I feel the immense pressure to perform perfectly.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a fantastic question. You've got to believe that you're already enough, and it doesn't depend on the end on a particular result going perfectly. If you tie your self-esteem to the result of the PhD, I can guarantee that getting the PhD won't solve the problem, because whatever gap is there, what happens every single time let's say you submit the PhD, you pass the defense, feels great for about 3 days. Then you're like, okay, what now? And whatever gap was inside, where's the next validation coming from? And a lot of people actually fall into a bit of a depression once they submit, even though they've achieved this goal. So you've got to believe you're already enough, right? And you mentioned kind of doing things perfectly. What does that even mean? It's an impossible standard, So you guarantee that you're going to feel terrible, even if you do kind of all right. So tie your self-esteem to the effort you put in. And if you try something and it doesn't work, but you gave it your best shot, then your attitude needs to be, okay, what can I learn from this? How do I respond to this? If it's like, oh, I'm rubbish, I'm never going to succeed, I'm not the star student I thought I was going to be, well, then, you're pretty much stuck in that place. But if you say, what went wrong, and get curious about it, that's actually the kind of student you want to be, right? Not the one who wants to do, thinks they should do everything perfectly. So, you're already enough. Your self-worth does not depend on having a PhD. I know plenty of people with PhDs who aren't particularly nice people. And I know lots of people without who are great people, right? And it bears no relation. I think you've got to kind of work on that in yourself, let go of that association, do the work because you find it interesting and it's challenging. And bear in mind that ultimately, it's just a small part of your life. It is not what determines your value. And, there are other things. Other things are important too that make up a whole human being. And the PhD does not determine, it's not everything, basically.
Thank you for that. Okay, we're going to try and squeeze one more question in.
Sure, I can stay for a few more minutes. There's no problem.
So what advice do you have on dealing with feelings of loneliness while in grad school?
Make sure you're talking to people. Make sure that you have those contacts. It's something that needs an investment of time and effort. So it depends on your situation. If you're in a research group where there's an office that you can go to, getting to know other people, be interested in their work and in them as human beings. Maybe try and instigate like having a group coffee break, every day, or some kind of something maybe once a week. If you're working remotely or you never see anyone else, try and make those contacts. Maybe have a weekly Zoom meeting with other students. It takes a bit of effort to maintain, but it's super important. It's one of those kind of long-term investment things. If it gets to the point where you're feeling really lonely, it's not too late, but then it can take a while. It takes a bit of time to build those connections back up. And maybe just start by calling somebody, someone you've not spoken to for a while. Generally speaking, they'll be happy to hear from you. So.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. We do have someone that has said that they really needed to hear a lot of the things you've talked about, and they appreciate you taking the time to speak with us, and that it definitely felt like a life-changing talk for them. So thank you.
My pleasure.
I think that is definitely something we all can say, that there's been a lot of really great and very useful tips that feel like they can actually be applied, and not that it's too big to take the small steps. So thank you for taking the time to speak with us, and thank you for everyone who attended today. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. I'm glad you found it useful. If anyone wants to check out my website, it's phd.academy. And you can also contact me there. I know we haven't got through all of the questions, so just drop me an email. Go to the contact page, drop me an email, and I'll be happy to help out. So.
Perfect. Thank you. Also, be sure to check out James's YouTube page. Sarah was talking about a lot of really useful videos that are there as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, have a good day, and maybe we'll see each other again soon.
Hi, everyone.
Bye-bye.